The Academy Hall stretched wide across the station, high above the orbit of a dying blue star. Rows of curved seats made from dark metal curved downward toward the open stage, and every seat was filled with alien cadets who had come from distant worlds to learn the arts of command, of battle, and of survival. Their eyes glowed in many colors. Some were wide with curiosity, others narrowed with pride, and all were fixed on the tall, thin professor who stood at the center of the stage with his pale skin reflecting the cold light of the ceiling lamps. He carried no weapon, only a long staff that tapped against the floor with each step, a sound sharp and hollow, echoing against the silent walls. His voice rose above the quiet, slow and careful, like one who had seen many wars. Today, he said, the subject is fear. He walked slowly across the stage, his words steady. Fear is not weakness. Fear is not shame. Fear is the shadow inside every soldier, the weight that crushes armies, the chain that halts leaders, the silence before defeat. Fear is older than courage and older than hope. He looked over the crowd as if to see who would flinch, who would dare to meet his eyes. Some cadets shifted in their seats, claws scraped metal, wings folded tighter, mandibles clicked, but none spoke, none moved. The professor raised his hand and asked, "Who among you can show fear? Who among you will step forward and let the class see what it truly means?" The words fell heavy in the air. No one answered. The silence spread thicker. It clung like a fog. The great hall seemed colder. Every alien sat rigid as if trapped, as if waiting for another to move first. But no one dared. Fear itself had already filled the room, unspoken but powerful, a mirror of the very lesson. From the far side of the hall, a small figure sat with arms crossed and legs relaxed. Unlike the others, the figure leaned back slightly as though boredom had claimed him. Dark hair framed a plain human face, eyes calm and almost tired. This was the only human in the entire academy, a species many still called fragile, reckless, unpredictable. The professor's eyes turned toward the human, curious, but he said nothing, waiting. The silence grew longer, heavier, until at last the human raised one hand, a simple small movement that broke the still air like a spark. The cadets all turned their eyes, scales glittering, horns catching the light. The whispering began at once, low hisses, clicks, and strange tones rolling through the seats. What is the human doing? Why would the human respond? They wondered, but the human stood slowly, their steps calm, measured, each one echoing across the polished floor. They stopped at the edge of the stage, not yet climbing, and spoke in a voice that carried across the vast hall with simple words. "Do you want me to show you?" The hall went still again, more silent than before. Even the machines humming in the walls seemed to pause. The professor tilted his head, his eyes narrow, and for the first time in many years he seemed unsure. He had read many reports of humans, stories of strange courage and strange madness, but he had not expected this, not in a lecture hall, not in front of so many young cadets. He tapped his staff lightly, the sound sharp, then gestured for the human to step closer. The human smiled, faintly, as though pleased by the chance, and began to walk toward the center. The aliens watched with disbelief, their whispers returning but sharper now. The scaled ones hissed about weakness, the winged ones muttered about arrogance. The insectoid cadets clicked that humans were only mammals of soft skin and fragile bones, yet none dared to laugh too loudly, for something in the humans' calm unsettled them. The professor raised his voice again. "Class, observe, for the human wishes to demonstrate. Perhaps you will learn what fear truly is." The human looked around the hall, meeting every eye without flinching, and the cadets felt a strange unease, as though those calm eyes carried storms unseen, as though behind a relaxed stance was something coiled and sharp. The human's hand rested at their side. No weapon, no shield, only that steady gaze. Silence pressed once more, and for a moment it seemed that the lecture itself had become more than words. It had become a stage for something none of them had expected. The professor lowered his staff, his voice quieter now. "Then let us see. Let us learn," he said. The air felt charged, like the breath before thunder. The cadets leaned forward despite themselves, their bodies tense, their hearts pounding. The insectoid mandibles clacked nervously. The scaled tails twitched. The winged feathers shifted. But the human stood still, waiting, unshaken. And in that stillness the lesson began, not from the professor, not from any alien elder, but from the smallest figure in the hall, who had dared to raise a hand when all others sat silent. The moment the human's voice faded, the whispering grew louder and more restless, like a wave moving through the hall of alien cadets. Claws scratched against the metal seats and wings rustled with sharp tension, while mandibles clicked in uneven rhythm. Every creature carried disbelief in their movements, disbelief that one so small and so fragile dared to stand where none of them had courage to move. A reptilian cadet with scales of dark green leaned toward his neighbor and hissed softly that the mammal seeks attention, the human wishes to play a role it cannot understand. Another with tusks curved upward grunted that this is arrogance, not courage, only foolishness that will be punished when the demonstration begins. Yet despite their mocking words, none of them stood to replace the human. None of them moved to correct the situation. They only watched with wide, uncertain eyes. The professor remained still in the center of the stage, his staff lowered and his gaze fixed upon the human who waited calmly. His voice at last returned, but carried a tone of challenge. He asked the class what they believed fear was. Many spoke at once. "Fear is weakness," said the scaled one with sharp claws. "Fear is hesitation," said the winged student with feathers spread wide. "Fear is the scent that predators use to track prey," said the insectoid with clicking mandibles. Their voices overlapped in chaos until the professor raised his hand and silence returned. Then he spoke again, saying, "You define fear as weakness because that is how your ancestors taught you. You define it as shame because you believe it is the reason soldiers fall. But what if fear can be more? What if fear can be shaped into a weapon?" The class listened yet remained doubtful, their bodies tense, their eyes darting between the professor and the human who stood in the spotlight with steady expression, a quiet challenge in their calm breathing. Some students whispered to one another about stories they had heard of humans, tales of madness and battle, of humans charging into storms of fire and surviving where others would freeze. Some dismissed those tales as myths. Others feared they may hold truth, but still disbelief lingered, heavier than curiosity. How could such a fragile creature hold knowledge greater than the many proud species of the academy? The professor turned toward the human and asked simply, "What do you claim to know of fear that none here know?" The human answered with a voice calm and even, "I know that fear is not something to escape. It is something to hold. It is the sharpness that keeps us alive. Without fear we are blind. With fear we are awake." The words drifted through the hall, and the cadets shifted uneasily. Some shook their heads. Others muttered again about arrogance. Yet in their hearts they felt a strange weight press upon them, because the human did not speak like one boasting. The human spoke like one who had lived those words. The reptilian cadet slammed his clawed hand against the metal rail and hissed loudly enough for all to hear. "Then prove it, mammal. Prove that your fragile body knows more than the bloodlines of warriors." The professor raised his brow but did not silence the challenge. Instead he nodded and said, "Very well. If the human will accept, let us see a demonstration." The hall erupted in noise. Wings beat against the air. Mandibles clattered. Voices rose in protest and excitement. But above it all, the human only smiled faintly, as though the decision had been made long before this day. The professor asked for volunteers among the cadets to stand against the human and test the claim. Silence followed once again because despite their earlier words, none wished to face the unknown. They mocked the human, but they also feared the strange calm that unsettled their instincts. Finally, the insectoid cadet, with spiked arms, rose to its full towering height and stepped forward. Its steps heavy, its shadow long. It bowed its head toward the professor and clicked that it would accept the challenge. The professor agreed and gestured for both to step toward the center. The cadets leaned forward in anticipation, their disbelief fighting with growing curiosity. Many whispered predictions of humiliation. They said the human would tremble at the sight of the insectoid. They said the mammal would collapse before the sound of its roar. Some hoped to see the arrogance broken. Others wished secretly to see something unexpected, yet none could look away. All were caught in the tension of the moment as the human and the insectoid faced one another across the polished floor, one small and calm, the other vast and bristling with natural armor. The insectoid spread its arms wide, claws gleaming, mandibles opening with a guttural clicking roar that rattled across the hall. Vibration shook the seats. The sound carried raw violence. Alien cadets flinched, Wings recoiled, tails curled, but the human stood still, shoulders relaxed, eyes locked on the creature with unwavering calm. Not a step backward, not even a blink that revealed weakness. The silence that followed the roar was louder than the sound itself, for the cadets realized that the fragile mammal did not tremble, did not falter. Whispers rose again, softer this time, tinged with unease. They asked how could the human remain steady? How could it resist? Some muttered that it must be trickery. Some wondered if it was madness. The professor watched with deep interest, his staff pressed against the floor, and his eyes sharp with thought. Perhaps he was seeing the beginning of a truth he had long suspected but never witnessed. Perhaps humans carried something different within them. The insectoid hissed again and stepped closer, its claws scraping sparks from the floor, its shadow falling upon the human like a living storm. Yet the human raised their head and spoke in the same calm voice. You cannot scare me with noise. You cannot scare me with size, because fear is not what you do to me. Fear is what I choose to accept or reject. The word spread across the hall, and many cadets shook their heads in disbelief. Yet they could not deny the effect the insectoid had unleashed. Its might and the human had not moved. The professor raised his voice once more, telling the class to watch carefully, to listen, because what they were seeing was not defiance. It was understanding. The human was not denying fear. The human was shaping it. The reptilian cadet who had mocked earlier sat back now with narrowed eyes, uncertainty stirring in his chest. The winged cadet folded her feathers tight, unease in her breathing, and the insectoid itself hesitated, unsure how to continue when its natural display of terror had failed. The human tilted their head slightly and smiled faintly, not with arrogance but with certainty, as though they had always known that this moment would come, as though this was not a risk but a simple truth. And in that small gesture the cadets felt something colder than the insectoid's roar. They felt the weight of realization that fear could belong not to the predator but to the prey, that the human had turned the meaning upside down, and that truth was more frightening than the sharpest claw. The professor let silence linger for long breaths, then spoke quietly yet with force that carried through the room. This is why humanity cannot be measured by bone or claw or size. This is why the records of their wars confuse us, because where others see fear as weakness, they see it as fuel. They burn it until nothing remains, and in that fire they rise. His words settled deep into the minds of every cadet present. Though many still doubted, none could shake the image of the human standing, unmoved before the towering insectoid. None could forget the sound of calm words against the roar of rage. The cadets left that day whispering among themselves, some angry, some curious, some silent, but all carrying the same unsettled thought. The human had shown them something none of their species had ever dared to claim, that fear itself could be claimed, bent, and used as a weapon. And though they would not admit it aloud, the seed of doubt and awe had been planted within every heart. The silence inside the academy hall grew heavier after the insectoid's roar faded. Every alien eye locked upon the lone human, who stood without flinching, calm as though facing nothing more than a breeze. Whispers rose again, but weaker this time, like sparks that refused to catch fire. The professor lifted his staff and pointed toward the human, and said, "Let the demonstration continue. Let us see how far this claim can go." The human turned slowly, in a circle, letting their gaze fall on each cluster of cadets. Their voice carried across the room clear and steady. "I will not stand alone against noise and shadow. I ask for volunteers. Let those among you who believe fear is only weakness step forward and try to prove it against me." The request echoed strangely in the vast hall. The word seemed to linger longer than any shout, yet no one moved. Wings folded tighter, claws dug into seats, tails coiled around metal frames. Even the reptilian cadet, who had mocked earlier, looked away, unwilling to meet the human gaze. Finally, after long breaths, the insectoid hissed again, mandibles snapping in irritation. But before it could speak, another cadet rose from the higher rows. A beast-like alien with curved tusks and thick arms stepped forward, its heavy frame rattling the platform as it moved down the aisle. The crowd stirred with mixed relief and dread, for this cadet was known for strength and cruelty in sparring chambers. The human watched the approach with no change of expression, their hands resting at their sides, their shoulders relaxed. They asked again in the same calm tone, "Do not hold back. Try to scare me." The tusked cadet snarled, its breath misting the air with foul heat. It struck the floor with a massive foot, and the hall shook slightly. Several cadets flinched. One winged alien gave a sharp cry before silencing itself. Yet the human did not blink. They only tilted their heads slightly as though studying the tusked creature the way one might study a curious machine. The cadet raised its tusks high and bellowed a sound that rumbled through the metal walls, an echo of primal fury. Still the human did not move. Then they spoke softly but firmly. "You are trying to show me that I should fear you. But fear is not given. Fear is chosen." The word stirred the hall again. Many students shifted uncomfortably. Some shook their heads in disbelief, but some leaned closer, caught by a strange fascination. The professor's eyes gleamed with the spark of a scholar who sees proof forming before him. The tusked cadet growled and swiped its arm through the air, barely missing the human by an inch. The motion carried strength enough to shatter stone, yet the human remained rooted. They lifted their chin and met the cadet's eyes directly. My heart beats faster, but I do not yield to it. Fear knocks at my chest, but I open the door and walk through it. I am not empty of fear. I am full of it. And that is why I stand. The insectoid hissed from the side, clicking in anger, demanding that the professor stop this charade before the mammal embarrassed the academy further. Yet the professor raised his hand and silenced all voices. He said, "Let the human speak. Let the human finish. For what we are seeing has not been written in our texts." And so the human continued. They stepped closer to the tusked cadet, whose eyes widened ever so slightly. Then they turned to the insectoid and said, "You think size and claws and noise can crush me. But I tell you this. It is not your shadows that shape me. It is my acceptance of them. I do not run from fear. I use it. It sharpens me. It wakes me." The hall grew colder with those words. Even the hum of the machine seemed quieter. The cadets could not deny the unease within themselves, for though they mocked the human, their own bodies betrayed them. Their hearts raced. Their breathing quickened, because they felt something unnatural in the presence of a creature so small refusing to yield to terror. The tusked cadet stepped back involuntarily, its pride fighting its instinct. The insectoid hissed louder, but did not advance. The winged students folded their feathers around themselves. The reptilian tapped its claw nervously, and the professor lowered his staff with a nod, telling the class that the lesson is already before you. See how the human asks not for protection. See how the human calls fear into the open and claims it. The human turned again toward the gathered cadets, and their voice grew stronger though still calm. "You believe fear is the end of courage. You are wrong. Fear is the beginning of courage. Without it there is no reason to stand. Without it there is nothing to rise against. Our people grew on a world filled with storms that could swallow cities, with beasts that hunted in silence, with darkness that lasted for months. We felt fear every day, and so we learned to hold it, to carry it, to let it move us forward instead of back, and that is why we survive." Some cadets shook their heads again, unwilling to accept, yet the tremor in their movements betrayed doubt. The reptilian spoke loudly. "Enough. You claim too much. You cannot teach us with only words. Then prove that fear sharpens you. Let us see action, not speech." The human smiled faintly and answered, "Very well. Bring your fiercest. Let them try. And I will show you that I do not deny fear. I walk with it." The professor's staff struck the floor sharply, ringing like thunder. He declared that the challenge is set. Those who mocked must now rise. Those who doubted must now watch. The tusked cadet and the insectoid stepped side by side, uncertain whether to continue. But pride held them in place. The human moved closer until their small frames stood within the reach of both towering figures, their eyes calm, their chest rising slowly. Then they whispered words only the two of them could hear, soft and low. None in the hall caught the meaning, but all saw the effect, for the tusked cadet flinched as if struck, and the insectoid recoiled slightly, its mandibles clicking in. Unease. The human's calm presence seemed to seep into their defenses and turn them inward against themselves. The rest of the hall leaned forward, desperate to know what had been spoken, but silence ruled. The professor did not ask, he only watched, his gaze heavy, his thoughts racing, for in that moment he understood that humans carried something none of them could mimic, a way of facing the abyss without collapsing, a way of turning the shadows into strength. He raised his voice once more and told the class, This is not madness. This is mastery. You may call them fragile, but you cannot call them weak. You may call them reckless, but you cannot call them blind, for they see what you refuse to see. That fear is not an enemy, it is a tool. The humans stepped back finally and spread their arms slightly as if to offer themselves again. Do you wish to try more? They asked. Do you wish to send another? Silence answered, for none moved, none spoke. Every cadet sat heavy with their own thoughts, some with disbelief still clinging, some with awe creeping in, some with anger at the humiliation, but none could rise to challenge. The professor let the silence stand because silence itself was proof that the human had unsettled the very core of their beliefs. The hall of the academy trembled with a silence so deep that every cadet could hear the pulse of their own hearts. The air seemed thick and heavy as though invisible chains had wrapped around every student present. The human stood calmly at the center of the stage, surrounded by towering forms of alien cadets who now hesitated in ways no one had thought possible. And in that hesitation the professor's eyes glimmered with quiet revelation, for he knew this was the moment when the lesson of fear would transform into something none of the young soldiers would ever forget. The human took a slow breath and let their words roll into the air with a weight that seemed to cut through the quiet like a blade. Fear is not weakness. Fear is not a chain. Fear is the reason I breathe deeper. Fear is the fire that lights the path when everything else is dark. Each word carried across the vast chamber, and every alien felt something stir in their chest, a sense of recognition though they would not admit it. The reptilian cadet shifted uncomfortably. The insectoid hissed with unease. The tusked warrior lowered its gaze for the first time, and the winged cadets folded their feathers closer to their bodies, for the human was not simply speaking. They were drawing shadows into the light. The professor gripped his staff tighter and asked the human to explain what gave them such strength. The human turned to him and answered with a voice that carried the echoes of storms. On Earth we learned to live with fear from the moment we opened our eyes. Predators stalked us in the night. Storms tore apart our homes. The earth itself quaked beneath us. And yet we endured. We learned to listen to fear, but not bow to it. We learned to let it sharpen our minds and quicken our steps. It did not make us weak. It made us adapt. And so we rose. Those words struck deep into the minds of the cadets who listened wide-eyed, because none of them had been raised in worlds so cruel. None had been forced to face such endless trials. The insectoid cadet hissed louder and demanded that words meant nothing unless backed by true action. The human's faint smile returned, and they stepped closer until their head reached only the chest of the towering insectoid. They spoke softly, yet their words cut sharper than any claw. You roar to show power, but you roar because you fear silence. You bare your claws because you fear being seen as weak. You think fear belongs only to prey, but you fear it yourself, and you cannot admit it. The insectoid froze, its mandibles clattering uncertainly, its armored chest heaving as if struck by an unseen force. The other cadets stared in disbelief, because they had never seen one of their fiercest peers falter before a creature so small. The human's calm voice spread again through the hall. Fear is not the end. Fear is the beginning. Without fear you cannot know courage. Without fear you cannot know strength. It is the weight that presses you down and forces you to rise higher. Those who deny fear are blind. Those who embrace it become unbreakable. The reptilian cadet clenched its claws until sparks scraped from the railing. The tusked warrior ground its teeth. The winged students looked at each other with uneasy recognition, because deep within themselves they knew the truth of those words, though pride fought against it. The professor lowered his staff slowly and allowed the silence to speak for him, for the silence itself was proof that the human's words were not lies. The cadets who once mocked now sat uneasy, their confidence shaken, their certainties cracked. The human had become a mirror reflecting their own hidden doubts, and in that mirror they saw themselves smaller than they had ever wished to believe. The turning point was here, and they could feel it in their bones. The human took another step forward until they stood in the center of the light. Their gaze swept across the entire room, and every cadet felt as though those calm human eyes rested upon them alone. I am afraid, the human said softly. I feel fear as much as you. But I do not run. I hold it close. I let it sharpen my heart. I let it move my legs forward when the storm comes. I let it push my hands to strike when death stares at me. and in that moment the hall seemed to shrink around them, as though the very walls leaned closer to hear the truth. The tusked warrior finally spoke with a voice lower than before, asking how such a fragile body could stand against storms and predators. The human turned to him and answered with quiet certainty, "Not because we are stronger in flesh, but because we are stronger in spirit. Our bodies bleed, but our will does not. Our bones break, but our fear does not chain us. We use it. We rise through it." And the cadets felt the weight of those words sink deeper, because they realized the human strength was not physical. It was something that could not be touched by claw or tusk or fang. The professor raised his staff high and declared to the hall that this was the truth they must remember, that fear itself was not the enemy, that the human had shown them what no scroll and no lesson could teach. He turned to the cadets and asked them what they felt now. Silence answered, not because they had no words, but because their pride refused to release them. Still, the silence itself revealed the answer. They felt fear, but not of the human's body, rather of the human's truth. The human bowed their heads slightly as though the moment was finished, but then they lifted their gaze once more and spoke words that pierced even deeper. "You will go to battle someday. You will face death in ways you cannot imagine, and when fear comes it will try to break you. If you treat it as weakness you will fall. If you hold it as strength you will endure. Remember what you saw today, not because of me, but because of what is inside you already waiting to be used." With those final words, the hall remained frozen, every cadet staring, every breath tight in their chest, for they knew this lesson had carved itself into them like a mark they could never erase. The professor lowered his staff with slow reverence. He did not praise. He did not scold. He only spoke in a voice of quiet finality. "The demonstration is done, but the lesson has only begun." The cadets bowed their heads without meaning to, their pride battling with their unease, and in that strange silence the human turned and walked calmly back toward their seat, their steps light, their expression unchanged, but the weight of their presence remained heavy in the hall, heavier than any roar, or claw or tusk. When the human sat down, the room did not return to normal. Whispers did not rise immediately. Laughter did not return. Instead, there was only thought, long and deep. A turning point had come, and none could deny it, though many would try. The cadets knew their view of fear had shifted forever, and above them the professor's eyes followed the human with quiet respect, for he understood that history had just shifted as well, though no record might capture it. The academy hall was drenched in silence, as though the very air had frozen into a heavy weight pressing down on every chest. The human remained standing in the center of the stage, their shoulders relaxed, their breathing calm, their gaze unwavering. The professor lifted his staff slowly, then lowered it again, without a word, for he sensed that words were no longer needed. What would follow now would not be spoken in theory, but shown in the truth of action, and the cadets, though filled with pride and doubt, could not look away from what was about to unfold. The insectoid cadet, with its armored body and spiked arms, clattered its mandibles in frustration. Shame burned in its posture, for it had already failed to shake the small mammal. Yet pride demanded another attempt. It stepped forward, towering over the human, and spread its limbs wide. The sound of grinding plates echoed through the chamber as it raised its claw high as if to strike. The cadets gasped, but the professor did not intervene. Instead, he fixed his eyes on the human, who only tilted their head and spoke softly. "Do not stop yourself. Do not hold back. Show me what you believe is fear." The insectoid hissed and struck the ground near the human's feet, sparks leaping from the metal floor. The vibration shook the hall, and several cadets cried out in alarm. The sound of armored plates slamming together rang out like thunder. Yet the human did not flinch. They looked up into the insectoid's many eyes and whispered words only it could hear, words so low none in the audience caught them. Yet the change was immediate. The insectoid's mandibles ceased their rhythm, its claws trembled, though no wound had been given, and its head lowered slowly as though unseen chains had been laid upon it. The watching cadets shifted uneasily, for they saw fear, now not in the human, but in the one who had tried to terrify. The reptilian cadet snarled, unable to accept what it saw. Its claws screeched against the railing as it demanded to be allowed to turn. The professor raised one hand, permitting it to step forward. The reptilian leapt from its seat, landing with a heavy crash upon the stage. Its scales gleamed under the pale light as it spread its muscular frame wide. its tongue flicking rapidly, tasting the air, filled with tension. It bared sharp teeth and hissed like boiling steam. Many cadets leaned forward, certain that this display would finally force the human to retreat. Yet the human did not move. Instead, they spoke again in that same steady voice. "If you wish to scare me, then look into me, not around me. For fear is not the shadow you cast, but the one you hide." The reptilian roared a sound like a storm tearing through iron. Its claws slashed the air, leaving scars on the floor. But as it gazed into the human's eyes, it faltered. Something in those calm eyes reflected back not weakness, but a mirror of its own fear. It stepped closer, its chest heaving. But the human did not retreat. Instead, they whispered again words that none else could hear, and the reptilian shuddered as though pierced by an invisible blade. Its hiss turned to silence, and its body coiled tighter, not in attack, but in hesitation. The cadets gasped again, for they saw the strongest among them fail to shake the human, and whispers spread quickly. What did the human say? What power do they hold? The tusked cadet rose again, unwilling to remain silent. It stomped forward, its thick arms flexing, its tusks gleaming under the lights. It growled low, shaking the walls as it towered above the human. Yet before it could unleash its fury, the human raised a single hand and spoke with quiet strength. "You believe fear belongs to me, but fear belongs to you. It is in your chest. It is in your breath. It is in the silence after your roar. And until you face it, you will always fear me." The tusked cadet froze, its tusks trembling, its growl caught in its throat. It stepped back slowly, unable to stand firm beneath the words of one so small. The professor struck his staff against the floor, sending a sharp ring through the hall. He declared to the cadets that what they saw was not illusion nor trick. The human had not cast spells nor wielded weapons. The human had only shown them their own reflection. Fear was not defeated by denial. Fear was transformed by acceptance. And this was the true demonstration. The cadets listened with wide eyes, some shaking their heads in denial, others leaning forward, caught in awe, none able to speak against what they had seen. The human turned again toward the audience and raised their voice louder than before, though still calm. "I am not without fear. My body trembles within. My heart beats faster. But I do not run from it. I take it into me. I let it sharpen my eyes and steady my hands. I let it push me forward instead of back. You may call me fragile, but you cannot call me blind. You may call me reckless, but you cannot call me broken. Fear is my companion, and with it I cannot be undone." The words sank into every ear and every heart, heavy as stone, sharp as fire. One winged cadet whispered that the human was dangerous, not because of their body, but because of their truth. Another murmured that no weapon could match such a mind. The insectoid shifted in shame. The reptilian kept its eyes down. The tusked cadet clenched its fists, but did not rise again, and the hall remained heavy with a silence that spoke louder than any roar, for every cadet had seen something none of their worlds had prepared them for. The professor stepped forward, standing beside the human now, his voice deep and solemn. He told the cadets that history would mark this day, though no stone might carve it. For here they had witnessed the strength of a species that embraced what others fled. They had witnessed the truth that fear is not the end of courage, but its beginning. And though many would doubt and resist, the memory would remain carved in their thoughts. The turning point had passed, and the true demonstration had revealed itself. The human lowered their hand and stood quietly beside the professor, their faint smile returning not as mockery, but as calm assurance. They had proven what words alone could not. They had shown the proudest cadets of the academy that fear, when embraced, could humble the strong and raise the fragile. And that truth would echo long after the demonstration ended. The cadets shifted uneasily, some with anger, some with awe, some with new curiosity, but none could return to the certainty they had before this day. The professor lifted his staff once more and ended the session with a single command: "Remember." Then he turned and walked slowly away, leaving the human standing in the light. The cadets sat in silence as the echoes of the staff faded, and in that silence they knew that everything had changed, for fear had been redefined before their eyes, not as a chain but as a weapon, not as weakness but as strength. And though their pride would resist, their hearts could not deny what they had seen. The hall of the academy remained still long after the professor's staff had struck the final note of the lesson. The cadets sat frozen in their seats, unable to speak, unable to laugh, unable to even whisper, for the weight of what they had seen held them tighter than chains. The humans stood silently in the center of the stage, their shoulders calm, their eyes steady, as though nothing unusual had occurred. Yet the silence surrounding them was proof that something had changed. Something vast and unshakable had been planted deep in the hearts of all present. The professor looked across the hall slowly, his ancient gaze resting on each cluster of cadets one by one. His voice came low but strong. You came here believing fear was shame, believing fear was weakness, believing fear was the end. But now you have seen that fear can be strength. Fear can be weapon. Fear can be fire. Remember what has been shown. The reptilian cadet, who once hissed with pride, now lowered his head, though his claws scratched against the rail, as if still fighting his own disbelief. The insectoid shifted uneasily, its mandibles clacking without rhythm. The tusked warrior's shoulders slumped, though it tried to keep its chest lifted, and the winged students wrapped feathers tighter around themselves, as though shielding their thoughts from the truth. Yet none could deny what their eyes had seen. The human turned slowly, their gaze sweeping across the room, and every cadet who met their eyes felt a strange heat rise in their chest. It was not the heat of anger alone, nor the burn of shame alone. It was something deeper, a recognition of what they themselves carried, but had long tried to bury. The human's voice came once more steady and clear. I did not defeat fear. I carried it. I am afraid, and still I move. You may call me weak, but my weakness walks beside me, and it makes me stronger. I did not silence fear. I listened to it, and in listening I learned to endure. The cadets shifted again, their breaths unsteady, for the words struck sharper than any blade. The professor raised his staff again, tapping it lightly against the floor as he spoke. Hear this well. A warrior who denies fear is blind. A warrior who admits fear is awake. But a warrior who uses fear is unstoppable. This is the lesson you must learn. The cadets glanced at each other uneasily. Their pride stung, their voices caught in their throats. Some wanted to shout denial, yet none could find the courage to rise. For every roar they had trusted had been silenced by a single calm voice. Every claw and tusk had failed before a fragile frame. The lesson was too clear to dismiss, though their pride resisted. The human took a step closer to the edge of the stage and lifted one hand slightly, as though reaching not for power, but for understanding. You will face battle. You will face darkness. You will face the silence before death. When that moment comes, do not throw fear away. Do not curse it. Take it. Hold it. Let it sharpen your strike. Let it steady your breath. Let it give you reason to live. Without fear you stumble blind. With fear you see clearly. The hall quivered with the weight of those words. Cadets shifted in their seats. Some clenched their fists. Others lowered their eyes. But all knew the human was speaking not fantasy but truth. The reptilian cadet finally raised his head, his eyes burning, though not with certainty, but with doubt fighting pride. He hissed that humans were strange, that their way was madness. Yet even as he hissed, his claws shook against the railing, betraying the storm within. The human only nodded and said softly, "Yes, we are strange, but our strangeness is why we survive. You may call it madness, but it is the madness that carried us through storms and wars and endless night, and perhaps it will carry you too if you can accept it." The reptilian hissed again, but lowered his gaze, unable to answer further. The insectoid raised its mandibles, clicking furiously. It demanded to know what words the human had whispered earlier, what secret had broken its stance. The human looked calmly into its many eyes and answered aloud this time. "I told you the truth you did not want to hear, that the fear you tried to give me was already yours. You carry it inside, and you let it rule you. That is why you trembled. That is why you recoiled, because you saw yourself in me." The insectoid froze again, its claws curling inward. The hall erupted in uneasy gasps and whispers, for every cadet realized that the human had not cast a spell, had not deceived, only revealed the mirror of truth. The professor lowered his staff and allowed the lesson to sink in deeper. His voice became softer, yet filled with weight. "Do you understand now?" he asked. "Do you see why the human cannot be measured in flesh or scale or claw? Do you see why reports of their kind speak of impossible endurance? For they have turned fear itself into a companion, into a guide, into a weapon." The cadets did not answer with words, but their silence was answer enough. They had seen, they had felt, and they could not erase it. The human walked back slowly to their seat, their expression unchanged, their steps calm, as though what had happened was nothing more than a conversation. But the cadets watched them with new eyes, some filled with unease, some filled with respect, some filled with quiet dread. Yet all of them changed. The professor stood tall upon the stage and spoke a final command before dismissing the gathering. Carry this lesson into every shadow, into every storm, into every battle, for fear will follow you wherever you go, and now you know how to walk beside it. The cadets rose slowly, still silent, their thoughts heavy, their pride shaken, their certainty broken, but their hearts unwillingly lit by a new flame. As they left the hall, the whispers returned, but they were not the same mocking whispers as before. Now they carried awe. Now they carried denial. Now they carried quiet terror. Some muttered that the human was dangerous. Others muttered that the human was a teacher they had never asked for. And some remained silent, knowing words would not capture the weight of what they had witnessed. The reptilian left with slow, heavy steps. The insectoid moved quickly, as though to escape its own thoughts. The tusked warrior walked with lowered head, and the winged cadets glanced nervously at the human, who sat still unmoving in the emptying hall. The professor remained behind a moment longer, watching the human with eyes that held both wonder and concern. He whispered to himself, though none could hear, "They will never forget this day. They will never see fear the same, and perhaps that is the gift and the danger of humanity." Then he turned and walked away, leaving the human alone with the fading echo of footsteps and the silence of a hall that had just witnessed a truth larger than any war. The academy hall emptied slowly, as if the weight of the lesson chained every cadet to their seat until the last possible moment. The echoes of claws and heavy feet dragged across the floor as wings folded tight and mandibles clacked with restless confusion. The human remained seated near the center, their eyes calmed, their body still, while around them the whispers of awe and denial tangled together like smoke. No one dared approach too closely, though many glanced back again and again as they departed. The professor stood at the far side of the chamber, his staff leaning against the wall, his expression unreadable, but his silence deep with thought. The reptilian cadet walked heavily down the corridor outside, its claws dragging sparks against the wall, as though trying to grind away the shame burning in its chest. It hissed quietly to itself that the human had only spoken tricks, yet in its heart it knew those calm eyes had shown something far more piercing than tricks. The insectoid rushed forward, mandibles snapping, as though trying to drown out its own memory of trembling before a fragile figure. Its armored limbs clattered in uneven rhythm, betraying its inner turmoil. The tusked warrior lagged behind, its tusks lowered, its heavy shoulders sagging. For the roar it once believed unstoppable had been silenced not by force, but by words. And the winged cadets walked close together, their feathers brushing nervously, as they muttered that they could still feel the echo of the human's voice lingering inside their chests. Within the hall, the professor finally stepped forward, tapping his staff once more on the stage. The sound rang hollow through the emptiness. He turned his gaze toward the human and spoke softly, yet with a tone of solemnity. "You understand what you have done." The human lifted their head and answered with quiet certainty. "I only showed them what they already carried. I only reminded them of what fear truly is." The professor studied them for a long moment before nodding slowly. "You have shaken more than their pride. You have shifted the foundation of their belief, and belief is harder to rebuild than broken stone." The human rose from their seat, walking toward the professor, their steps light but deliberate. Their voice came steady. They needed to see it. They needed to feel it. Words are nothing without weight, and so I gave them weight. The professor's lips tightened, though not with anger, but with concern. He said, "They will remember you with unease. Some will hate you for it. Some will fear you more than fear itself, and some will cling to your truth as though it is salvation. Be ready for all of them." The human only nodded calmly. "I am ready. I have always been ready, for fear walks with me, and I do not turn from it." The following days within the academy were no longer the same. Cadets who once mocked the human now whispered of them in the shadows. Some called them reckless. Some called them dangerous. Some even called them teacher, though they would not speak the word aloud. The reptilian trained harder than before, roaring with claws tearing through steel dummies. Yet every strike ended with a glance over its shoulder toward the human, who sparred silently, with nothing but focus. The insectoid avoided the training halls where the human walked. Its pride wounded deeper than it could admit. The tusked warrior grew quiet, spending long hours alone, as if searching for the strength it thought it once held. And the winged cadets whispered late at night about the strange calm of human eyes that saw storms, yet did not close. The professors of other classes noticed the shift. Discipline was sharper, yet silence hung heavier in the corridors. Lessons about fear and courage were no longer recited as doctrine, but carried like burdens. The human moved through it all without change, walking with calm steps, sitting with steady breath, training with quiet focus. And in their presence silence always followed. For the cadets could not shake the memory of claws trembling before words, could not erase the image of tusks lowering before calm eyes, could not forget that fear had been turned into strength before them. One evening the professor who had led the lesson on fear found himself standing upon the balcony of the academy, overlooking the stars. The human approached, standing beside him quietly. The professor spoke after a long silence. "I have seen many wars and many lessons, yet none unsettled me as much as what you did. You made them see that fear is not enemy but ally. You made them see that the storm inside is not to be denied but embraced." The human looked out into the dark expanse of stars and replied, "We are born in storms. We are born in shadows. We survive not because we are strongest, but because we walk with fear rather than run. It is our companion and our guide." The professor tapped his staff softly against the floor, the sound echoing into the night. He said, "Then this academy has gained a lesson greater than any text could hold. But beware, for not all will thank you. Some will carry resentment, and resentment can be as dangerous as ignorance." The human nodded, once again their voice calm. "I do not seek thanks. I only seek truth." The professor studied them with quiet respect, and perhaps even a trace of awe. Across the academy whispers continued to grow. Some cadets practiced alone, repeating to themselves the words they had heard, trying to shape their fear into strength. Others resisted harder than before, training to drown their doubts in noise and fury. Yet none escaped the change, for once a truth is seen it cannot be unseen, and each cadet now carried within them the memory of the human standing calm against roar and claw and tusk. And each night, as they closed their eyes, that memory returned, sharper than ever. The human remained as they always were, calm, steady, unshaken. They did not boast of their demonstration. They did not mock those who doubted. They simply trained and listened and watched, and in their stillness the lesson continued without words. Every glance reminded the cadets of what they had felt. Every step reminded them of what they had seen. Every breath reminded them of the truth they could not deny. Fear was not weakness. Fear was strength waiting to be claimed. The professor called the cadets again weeks later for another session on courage. The hall filled once more with the same faces, though their eyes were different now. Sharper, more uncertain, yet more awake. The professor stood tall and began. "Last time you saw fear through human eyes. Now tell me what courage means." The cadets spoke hesitantly, their words no longer rehearsed, but searching. "Courage is not the absence of fear," one said. "Courage is walking with fear," another said. "Courage is listening to fear, but not bowing to it," another added. The professor nodded slowly, his eyes flicking toward the human, who sat quietly at the side. And for the first time the cadets realized they were speaking truths, not because they had read them, but because they had lived them. As the hall emptied, once again the professor lingered. His voice carried softly as he looked at the human. "You have changed them. You may have changed more than you realize." The human only gave a faint smile, their eyes still calm. Change was always the lesson. They needed to see what we see, to feel what we feel. And now they will carry it into every battle. The professor turned away slowly, but his heart carried the weight of those words.